Next is your enterobiasis or your pinworm infection, or in the dialect, it's better known as gikigwa, no kigwa. So that is caused by your Enterobius vermicularis. So it is a small 1 cm in length, white, thread-like nematode or roundworm, and this inhabits the cecum, the appendix, the adjacent areas of the ileum, and the ascending colon. For the mode of transmission, it is through fecal oral route, typically by ingestion of the embryonated eggs that are carried either from the fingernails, clothing, bedding, house dust, or through auto-inoculation. So humans are the only known host. So it is highest in children 5 to 14 years of age, and there is an increase in incidence in children who live, play, and sleep close together. For the clinical manifestation, there would be itching and restless sleep that is secondary to the nocturnal perianal or perineal pruritus. This is a very characteristic of your enterobius. That is why if we see if children, no, even gali, it's a joke among adults that they are frequently scratching their anal area, no, at night. Muna gikigwad. It's very characteristic of your enterobius. So this is because the gravid females, they migrate at night, particularly at night. That is why it's a characteristic no nga night nocturnal pruritus ani, no? And then there it will migrate at night at the perianal and the perineal regions, and there they will deposit approximately 15,000 eggs in one night. So the itchiness would actually depend on the intensity of the infection, the psychologic profile of the infected individual and the family, as well as the allergic reaction to the parasite. So here in the picture, so again, the cycle would begin with the ingestion of your food, no, containing your embryonated eggs. So after it would reach, no, the small intestine, then the eggs will hatch into larvae. And once the larvae become an adult form, it will inhabit the cecum. So the gravid female then migrates to the perianal region at night to lay the eggs, which causes the symptoms of intense itchiness at night, again, nocturnal pruritus ani, and then the eggs are then excreted through the feces. However, due to the itchiness, frequently there would be perianal scratching. So thereby, so when the child or the person scratches the anal area, there would be some eggs that would stick here, no, sa fingernails, and then accidentally put inside the mouth. That is why it's one of its mode of transmission is auto inoculation. And then once again, no, with that auto inoculation or a person again ingesting the embryonated egg, no, kind of embryonate there in the soil due to adequate and environmental condition, then the cycle begins once again. So here for the lab workup, so again, having a history of nocturnal, no, nga perianal pruritus or nocturnal ani, no, kay it's actually strongly suggestive of your enterobiasis. And for the lab workup, so for the definitive diagnosis, that would be identification of your parasite eggs or worms. So it's frequently your Scotch tape method, as in Scotch tape, no, so the microscopic examination of adhesive cellophane tape or Scotch tape is pressed against the perianal region early in the morning. It would frequently demonstrate the egg. Again, early in the morning because we expect that the laying of eggs is at night. And then we can also do in repeated examination. So not just one time. We can repeat the exam like 3 consecutive days, 2 consecutive days. That is to increase the chance of detecting the ova. And then one examination already detects 50% of the infection. So if it's 3, 90%. If you go up to 5, that's already 99%. Then you can also do your digital rectal exam, not to obtain samples for a wet mount. So for the treatment, the drug of choice would still be your albendazole. That's 400 milligram once a day orally. But for this enterobiasis, you have to repeat it once again 2 weeks later, now after the first dose. So this is again for all age groups, and the cure rate exceeds 90%. Alternatives would be your mebendazole and your pyrantel pamoate. And then for supported treatment, that's morning baths, and then frequent changing of the underclothes, bed sheets, and decrease environmental egg contamination. And also, this would also decrease the risk for auto-infection. So for the complications, so due to the aberrant migration to ectopic sites, occasionally it may lead to appendicitis, chronic salpingitis, pelvic inflammatory disease, peritonitis, hepatitis, and ulcerative lesions in the large or small bowel. So for prevention, so household contacts can be treated at the same time. So again, we do not just treat for enterobiasis specifically. We don't just treat the patient. We also treat the family members who may be infected, as well. So we repeat the treatment every 3 to 4 months if with repeated exposure. And again, we have to emphasize to them that good hand washing or hand hygiene is actually the most effective method of prevention. Next is hookworm infection. So it is caused by Necator americanus. This is the most common cause of human hookworm infection. You have your Ancylostoma duodenale. This is the one that causes the classic hookworm infection. And you have your Ancylostoma brasiliensis. This is the principal cause of your cutaneous larva migrans. So it is common in rural areas where human feces is used as a fertilizer or sanitation is actually inadequate. Highest prevalence would be in sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, and tropical regions of the Americas. So for the infective stage for the hookworm, it is the filariform larvae. For the mode of transmission, For the mode of transmission, your N or your Americanos and your duodenale, it is through penetrating the skin, and then your duodenale, it is through ingestion. So then the larvae enters the human host by skin penetration. So it undergoes an extra intestinal migration by which it goes through the venous circulation and the lungs. Then it's swallowed. So the larvae that's ingested may undergo extra intestinal migration, or it may remain in the GI tract. For the clinical manifestation, the major clinical manifestation is actually related to the intestinal blood loss, similar to that of um, kaning trichuriasis. So there is pallor, protein malnutrition, eventually would lead to physical growth retardation and cognitive and intellectual deficits. So these are basically, again, due to anemia, secondary to iron deficiency anemia from the chronic intestinal blood loss, meaning your parasite is also competing with the host in terms of blood iron. So the chronic intestinal blood loss, again, this is due to the adult hookworms adhering tenaciously to the mucosa and the submucosa of the proximal small intestine by using their cutting plates or teeth and a muscular esophagus that creates a negative pressure in their buccal capsules. So the rupture of the capillaries in the lamina propria is followed by blood extravasation and some of the blood ingested directly by your hookworm itself. So other than anemia, they will also have dermatitis, manifested as vesiculation and edema, and often referred to as your ground itch, when it penetrates the human skin. For your Ancylostoma brasiliense, it can result in lateral migration of the larva to cause the characteristic cutaneous tracts of cutaneous larva migrans. So as the larvae, no, some of the larvae will go to the lungs, so the patient would experience coughing and pharyngitis. So as the larvae would also enter the GI tract, then the manifestation is more of upper abdominal pain, anorexia, and diarrhea. So there is also an infantile form of the hookworm infection, no, your ancylostomiasis. So that is due to the heavy infestation of your Ancylostoma duodenale, which affected children may present with diarrhea, melena, failure to thrive, and profound anemia. So this is also what we call your cutaneous larva migrans, or this is otherwise known as your creeping eruption, which is caused particularly by your Ancylostoma brasiliense. So the larvae localized at the epidermal or dermal junction, and this would migrate in this plane, moving at a rate of 1 to 2 cm per day, basically magkamang-kamang through the skin. So the response of the parasite is characterized by a raised erythematous serpiginous tracts, which occasionally form a bulle. So the lesions may be single or numerous and are usually localized to an extremity, although any part of the body may actually be affected. So as the organism will migrate, new area of involvement may appear every few days. So there is intense localized pruritus, but there are no systemic symptoms. So for the lab workup, the eggs of the hookworm can be detected by direct fecal examination. So quantitative methods are available to determine whether a child has a heavy worm burden that can cause your hookworm disease. So for your cutaneous larva migrans, you can, like here, you just can see it through the skin. So this diagnosis is made on clinical examination of the skin and basing on the history that the patient may recall the exact time and the location of the exposure, since there is an intense itch at the site during the time nga the worm was able to penetrate the skin of the affected or the patient. So for the treatment, we can give your albendazole 400 milligram, one dose for all ages. However, it may require additional doses in those with refractory cases of your kanang Necator americanus. So we can also give your mebendazole, no, and then another alternative would be your Pyrantel pamoate. So for the complications, because of the aberrant migration to the ectopic site, occasionally it may lead to appendicitis, chronic salpingitis, pelvic inflammatory disease, peritonitis, hepatitis, ulcerative lesions in the large or in the small bowel. For the prevention, we can decrease hookworm infection by implementing programs of periodic deworming, improvements in the sanitation, health education, and avoidance of using human feces as a fertilizer. So as part of the prevention of parasite infection, so here in our setting, this is the recommendation. So basically deworming, no? So this is based on the PPS Preventive Pediatric Healthcare Handbook of 2024. So we start deworming our children once they reach the age of 12 months old. Then ideally, this should be repeated every 6 months. So this is a routine deworming here in our setting here in the Philippines, no, by the DOH. So the options would be to start the patient on albendazole The albendazole is the one that's available in our local health centers. So for albendazole, so for 12 months old to 23 months old, the dose is 200 milligrams. Remember how this is routine deworming. So 200 milligrams, no, and then if it's a 24 months old child and above, the dose would already be 400 milligrams. That's already the maximum or the adult dose. So both single dose orally, and then we give that routine, supposedly, no, ideally every 6 months. So again, this is the one available in the local health center. It's actually for free in the local health center. It's not available in the pharmacies. It's in a tablet form. It's not, there's no liquid form available. Next is the other option, but however, currently being pulled out in the market. It's not available na sa pharmacies. You have your mebendazole, no? And then the dose is 500 milligrams orally. That's single dose every 6 months for children, again, 12 months and above. It used to be a chocolate flavor, no, small bottle, and then just one take raunta. But again, I think for the past 1 to 2 years, it has not been available in the pharmacies. So, by the way, you have to remember that those both of these deworming drugs should be taken on a full stomach. For the contraindications of deworming, so if there is severe malnutrition, if there's really a high grade fever, if there's really profuse diarrhea, there's abdominal pain, serious illness, and previous hypersensitivity to antihelmintic drugs. Those are the contraindications to doing your deworming. Okay, anyway, deworming is not this routine deworming as part of the DOH. It's not actually an emergency. No, so at least have the patient na ma-well siya before initiating deworming, the routine deworming. That's my last slide for the parasitic infections. So I'll go straight now to the 5 Ps of STI, and then after is the infection prevention and control. So are the slides visible? Visible, Rasha?
Yes, Doc.
Yes
All
po,
right, so I'll
yes, Doc.
proceed. All right, for STIs, no, very short run ni, 5 Ps in the approach for healthcare providers. So sexually transmitted infections are pathogens that are acquired and cause infection through sexual contact. So the prevention and control of STIs are based on the following 5 major strategies. First, accurate risk assessment and education and counseling of persons at risk regarding ways of avoiding STIs through changes in sexual behaviors and the use of recommended prevention services. Second would be pre-exposure vaccination for vaccine preventable STIs. Like, for example, we already have a vaccine available against your HPV or your human papilloma virus. Third is the identification of persons with an asymptomatic infection and persons with symptoms associated with an STI. Fourth is effective diagnosis, treatment, counseling, and follow-up of persons who are infected with an STI. And the fifth, evaluation, treatment, and counseling of the sex partners of persons who are infected with an STI, because aside from the patient, we also need to treat all the partners of that patient. So the primary prevention of STIs would include assessment of behavior risk. So such as assessing the sexual behaviors placing the person at risk for the infection. Also, assessment of biologic risks, such as testing for risk markers for STI and HIV acquisition or transmission. So we have to inform all the tests for STIs they are receiving, and we have to notify them uh, to notify about the tests for common STIs such as your genital herpes, trichomoniasis, mycoplasma genitalium, HPV. And then we also have to, of course, we took a test, so we have to inform them of the results and if it's positive, no, or whatever the result is, we also have to give them the recommendations for future testing. Efforts to ensure that all persons receiving STI care, regardless of personal circumstance. Since this is considered as a sensitive topic to our patients, we should have effective interviewing and counseling skills. So we routinely obtain sexual history from patients and address the risk of reduction. So for us in pediatrics, this is part actually of our heads assessment, diba? It's one of the S. So among adolescents. So again, we do heads assessment when the child is 10 years old, because according to the Bright Futures Academy and AAP, 10 years old and actually up to 21 years old, no, it's considered as an adolescent. So again, 10 years old, part of your history taking is already your heads assessment. So when we interview the adolescent, remember we should interview them alone. No parents or guardians should be around. If there is, kindly or respectfully, ask them to leave for one moment so that the adolescent may be able to express their concerns and answer the questions without hesitation. Because if the parents are around, sometimes it's actually the parents who will answer for the child, no, or the child will not be truthful. Okay, of course, diba? We want to be in good to their eyes, of course. No, that's normal for us children to our parents. So respect, compassion, and a non-judgmental attitude towards all patients are essential to obtaining a thorough sexual history and delivering effective prevention messages. So effective techniques for facilitating rapport. So you should have open-ended questions. It should be understandable. It should be non-judgmental and a normalizing language. And then you could also start, no, so don't directly hit, no, or address the patients. One of your clue is to start with the surroundings and then eventually barkada hantod sa until you arrive na to the patient. Okay, if you directly address the patient right away, the normal instinct would be no doc, no, 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 right? So here are the 5 P's, not approach for healthcare providers. So first is the partners. So you can ask, like, are you currently having sex with any kind? Or what is the gender of your partners? Second P, that's practices. So you can ask, so to understand, so you can tell this to the patient or to the adolescent. So to understand any risk for sexually transmitted infection, I need to ask more specific questions about the kind of sex you are having or you have had recently. And then what kind of sexual contact do you have or have had? And do you have any vaginal sex, or meaning penis in vagina sex? No, so you really have to describe it. Okay, sometimes sila kay they would not really understand. Then you have did you have anal sex, meaning penis in rectum or anus? And then do you have oral sex, meaning mouth or penis, vagina? Then next P is protection from STIs. So you can ask, do you and your partner discuss prevention of STIs and HIV as well? And then, do you and your partners discuss getting tested? And for condoms, what protection methods do you use? In what situation do you use condoms? Next P, that's past history of STI. So you can ask, have you ever been tested for any STI or HIV? Or have you been diagnosed with an STI in the past? And have you had partners who had STI? So additional questions in identifying HIV and viral hepatitis risk. So you may ask, have you or any of your partners ever injected drugs? Or is there anything about your sexual health that you have questions about? So the last P, that would be your pregnancy intention. So you may ask, do you think you would like to have like a child or more children in the future? So more important, you can also ask how important it is to you to prevent pregnancy until then. Or are you and your partner using contraceptive or practicing any form of birth control? And you may also ask, would you like to talk about ways to prevent pregnancy? That's it for the 5 Ps of healthcare providers no approach for STI. So I'll move to the last topic, which is infection prevention and control. This is the last for the entire infectious lecture under me. So, do you have a lecture after this? Wala na po.
Naa doc kay Dr. Masalunga.
Okay, ang NTP. Sige, gamay naman lang ni. Right. So for the modes of transmission, no, these are critical elements of healthcare associated with infection prevention work, and this would include your contact, droplet, and airborne. So for contact transmission, this involves direct contact with the patient or indirect contact with the surfaces or patient care items in the patient's environment that are contaminated with the offending microorganisms. So an example of which is your rotavirus that is through contact with the feces of the patient's diaper. So next would be droplet transmission. So this occurs through large respiratory droplets generated by coughing, sneezing, or talking. So the droplet containing the microorganism or the organism travels approximately 3 feet from an infectious person. So those droplets are heavy, so they do not remain suspended in the air for long periods of time. So an example of which is your influenza, as well as your tuberculosis. It's a very good example of droplet transmission within 3 feet from the infected person. Next is airborne transmission. So this occurs through small particles which remain suspended in the air and can be wildly dispersed by air currents. So the very good example of which is your measles. Remember that in your measles, even if the person or the patient or the one with measles has already left the room, the virus can stay in the air approximately 1 to 2 hours from which the person already have left. So although many infections can occur through transmission directly from an infectious host to a susceptible host, infection can also occur through contact with contaminated environments, whether through contaminated surfaces, fomites, or previously occupied airspaces. For the appropriate patient placement and isolation, so if we immediately isolate children, those who have respiratory symptoms, and those suspected with respiratory diseases such as your COVID and your influenza, so in a separate, well-ventilated waiting room, basically open air. No, it is if this is not possible, then we position them at least 1 meter apart from others. And if it's a child 2 years old and above, we give them masks to wear. So if it's a child less than 2 years old, in the recommendation, we do not let them wear a mask because of the risk of suffocation. The room or the area should also have designated or dedicated toilets, hand hygiene station, and waste bins for disposal of used paper tissues if possible. So next is we separate the well child from the sick visits. So this is to minimize the risk of infection. So separate rooms it should be ideal unta, no, supposedly that there's really a designated room for sick visit, and there is another designated room for well child visit. So like another example, if you really have just one room, you schedule the well child visits in the afternoon, and then the morning you will schedule the sick visits. Separate ninyo siya. Harun, they would not be side by side with each other as much as possible there in the waiting area. So we must ensure standard infection prevention and control precautions for all patients in the primary healthcare facility at all times. So this is to reduce the risk of transmission of bloodborne, respiratory, and other pathogens. So for the precautions and isolations, these are terms to describe in a specific patient care setting which equipment, practices, and procedures should be used to best prevent against a transmission event related to a known or suspected pathogens. So first is standard precaution. So this is used in any setting in which patient care occurs to prevent transmission of a potential pathogen to or from a healthcare worker. This is regardless of suspected or confirmed infection status of all of the patient. So basically, this is the basic precaution we institute on all our patients there in the hospital and even in our clinic settings. So here, this would include, you're doing your proper hand hygiene, use of an appropriate personal protective equipment or your PPE, and then this would be required based on the risk of exposure to body and blood fluids, including your expectoration and respiratory secretion. So like, for example, is there a need to use a mask or an eye protection? Okay, you are going to do intubation. So it depends upon the need. Next is when coughing, no, or sneezing, so cover the nose with mouth and nose with a tissue, or do the respiratory etiquette, katong arika here, no, in the shoulder, mukaf, instead of your hand, literally your hand. Next would be routine environmental hygiene of cleaning the surrounding room, and then decontamination of the medical devices. And then here is safer sharp practice, to prevent needle stick injuries, and then proper management of your blood and body fluid samples, soiled linens, and clinical waste. So isolation procedures or transmission-based precautions are targeted to prevent transmission of known suspected pathogens or in the setting of specific syndromes like your infectious diarrhea, upper respiratory tract symptoms. So next would be your contact isolation. So this would include the use of your gloves here and your gown here. So contact, no? And then this is, so bali, it's standard precaution plus contact transmission. So basically, standard precaution is really kanang ano na siya, it's really imposed na jud siya. So it's up to depending with the case, if you need to add another form of precaution or isolation to the patient. So the aim is to limit spread not of the pathogen by direct contact with the patient. So for example, those with kanang AGE, those with rotavirus, norovirus. Next is droplet isolation. So remember, this is within 3 feet from the person affected. So it includes protection of mucosal surfaces from expectorated large droplets. And this would include the use of face mask and eye protection. So again, some pathogens may spread efficiently either contact and droplet, like for example, your rhinoviruses in your common colds. So thus, it can also be that you put the patient on two forms of isolation. So combination of uh, contact and your droplet isolation plus your standard precaution. Automatic yun ng standard precaution. Basic na siya. Next is airborne isolation. So it is used for pathogens that are readily aerosolized, and requires the use of eye protection and the use of an appropriate respirator. So when you say appropriate respirator, that's either N95 or a powered air purifying respirator, or your PAPR, depending on the employee. So this was very rampant during the time of the pandemic. So additionally, patients with airborne infections would require placement in a specialized airborne infection isolation room. No, your AIIR. So which have specialized air handling that can maintain negative pressure. Basically, negative pressure rooms, no, compared to the surrounding environment. Because in that room, there is an increase in your air turnover per unit time. So next is respiratory hygiene measures. So it is of help if we display graphic information, no, for patients on how to perform proper hand and respiratory hygiene. So there in our hospital, in hospitals, no, we place, like for example, near the where we do our hand washing, there's a WHO chart on how to do hand washing, not so as to help our patients, to help remind them, no, of the proper respiratory and etiquette, and as well as doing proper hand washing. So again, for example, your cough etiquette, or the need for to cover the nose, no, with a tissue like here, no, or when coughing and sneezing, ari sa imong elbow or sa shoulder, the need for proper disposal, no, of the tissue that you use during sneezing. And then here is again proper hand washing, and then wearing a mask if you are really having coughing, or you have cough, or coryza or rhinitis or sneezing. Again, for children, if it's less than 2 years old, it's not recommended to let them wear a mask yet because of the risk of suffocation. So it's 2 years old and above that we can use face mask. So for hand hygiene, so please remember, no, to perform hand hygiene using your soap and your water, or your alcohol-based hand rub that contains 70% alcohol. So it's only 70%. You should be careful because there are alcohols na 60, 40, no, or just merely kanang no specification at all of the percentage. No, so here, so we do hand washing before touching the patient, before a clean or aseptic procedure, after body fluid exposure risk, after touching the patient, and after touching the patient's surroundings. No, so meaning in every move, please do not forget to do hand hygiene. Next is PPE. So this was widely used during the pandemic, no, during the COVID pandemic. So the use of PPE, such as your medical mask, gloves, gowns, and eye protection, to reduce exposure to pathogens when there is a risk of splashes, contact with patient's blood, body fluids, secretions, excretion, and and non-intact skin. So we wear medical mask, or if it's a high spread or confirmed case area, really we have to wear an N95 or a respirator at all times if it's a highly contagious respiratory disease such as your COVID-19. So here you have your standard or low spread area. You have your full PPE in a high spread area and your enhanced PPE among those with confirmed COVID-19 cases. So when you say low spread area, mga OPD, no? And then when you say high spread area, um, like for example, pwede siya kanang in the wards. And when you have your confirmed, no? So those na na-adjud sila, they are there in the COVID-19 because we have a separate ward for you. We used to be during the pandemic, we really have a COVID-19 ward. So that's the time. Katong all confirmed COVID cases, we put them there. So they really have to in wear the full PPE, enhanced PPE. So here is the sequence, no? So this is really in order so as not to break the uh the chain, no, of your to prevent a hair, there is a hair, and then mask, and then ang standing ka ng face shield, and then last would be the gloves. And then if you doff, meaning you will remove it, so you will start with the gloves, then remove the gown, then remove the eye shield, then last would be the mask. And then again, do your hand hygiene. Next is needle stick injury. So we do not resheath or recap a needle, or if it's necessary, you do one-handed scoop or fishing technique. Please never leave needles unattended and avoid passing unsheathed needles in between staff. That is why if we pass staff, you have to raise it, no, so as to prevent from poking your colleagues with a needle. So use a sterile single-use disposable needle and syringe after each injection. So in the past, they used to reuse needles, so sa karaan, but now our needles are single use only. So we dispose used needles and sharps safely in appropriate puncture resistant containers and never fill a safety box more than 3/4 full. So dili siya palabian og puno, no? You should leave a bit of space, and then plan safe handling and disposal of needles before using them. So make sure there is a safety box at arm's reach when you give your injection. So in cases of needle stick injury, no, if this would really happen to you, the first is to clean it. No, so do encourage bleeding by applying gentle pressure. Do wash with soap and water. Do not scrub the affected area. Do not suck the area to remove the blood. And then you have to report it ASAP, no, to the infectious control, and then you report it to the supervisor and the designated doctor in the hospital. So next is to treat it. So we have to really retrieve the HIV, Hep B, Hep C status of the patient and start an appropriate treatment within 72 hours. So it's very hassle to have a needle stick injury. So I hope everyone will really take care of themselves, not to have any needle stick injury during their entire life being a doctor. All right? I'm down to my last 3 slides already. So next is to clean and disinfect all surfaces in the facility routinely. So especially on high touch surfaces or whenever it's really visibly soiled or if contaminated by body fluids. So you wipe with detergent and then use approved disinfectant such as your 0.1% sodium hypochlorite. So next is to clean and disinfect equipments regularly, regardless of the case of the patient. So before and after you go to a certain patient, no, you really have to disinfect your personal stethoscope, your thermometer, your otoscope, your ophthalmoscope, or any medical equipment. No, so don't jump to one patient to another without disinfecting it. So if a highly contagious infection disease is suspected, you really have to sanitize surfaces after each patient encounter. That's why ako personally in the clinic, no, I'm really usikan or a waste of the alcohol because every before and after patient, you really have to disinfect the surroundings as well as your equipments. Next would be also the I do not forget kanang environmental surfaces. Also routinely disinfect them. So like for example, door switches, door handles, the one when your patient or the parents open no in the door. So that's also one of the things that you really have to clean. Not okay, frequently maneglect siya. All right. And then next would be a critical component of preventing transmission of infectious pathogens in healthcare settings would be appropriate environmental cleaning, elimination of potential reservoir, and disinfection and sterilization of medical equipment. So last would be safe safe waste management. So if you have noticed, the different waste of our hospitals actually have different colors. No, so um, there's a designated waste container for blood, for body fluids, secretions, no, human tissues, PPE equipment, no. So here, para mas more ano siya. So here, if it's a black, no, that would it's more of a non-infectious or dry waste. It's green, so it's a non-infectious wet waste, like from the kitchen, from the dietary. If it's yellow, so it's more of infectious here, infectious and pathological waste. If it's yellow with a black band, so that's chemical waste that would include that contain heavy metals. And then if it's orange, so these are radioactive waste. And if we have red, those are sharps and pressurized containers. All right, that's my last slide for this morning. So for tomorrow, you can have it as your study time. All right. Si
Thank you,
Rash, okay
Doc.
na ta, Rash?
Yes, Doc. Thank you, Doc.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Keep safe. Bye bye.
So, good morning. Thanks, Doc Maylin, for your lecture. We'll have a 5-minute break, guys. So I'm sure na you want to stretch. Some of you might be folding clothes because this is Zoom. I'm not really sure. Let's begin at 10:15. Although we might have to finish by 11 because unfortunately, I have another conference. So what we cannot finish today, we will continue tomorrow. Okay? So yeah, let's take a break and we'll start at 10:15. Face-to-face lectures because like what I mentioned earlier, Zoom is not ideal, especially for the clinical fields, okay, for the clinical sciences, especially that when we do Zoom, some of you are sweeping the floor or folding clothes. And although that is fine, what I want to say is that there are a lot of distractions. Okay? So although this lecture was requested by Dr. Irish, about tuberculosis, we will actually focus on the National Tuberculosis Control Program because we have one guideline for the National Tuberculosis Control Program and it applies to both pediatric and adult patients. So where applicable, I will emphasize the guidelines that are pediatric specific. So you know very well that I am not a clinician, I am a pathologist. But the good thing about tuberculosis when it comes to the diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of tuberculosis, we need to follow one guideline. And most of you have heard that Tuberculosis is the greatest clinical mimicker of various illnesses. It can mimic malignancies. In fact, if it occupies certain locations, let's say the pituitary or the ovaries or the gastrointestinal tract, it can really present as if it's, let's say, mesenteric artery ischemia, if it involves the colon or the gastrointestinal tract. It can present with hypogonadism or a decrease in the other hormones when it involves any of the components of the pituitary and the corresponding organ. Okay, the hypothalamus pituitary axis. So it's the greatest mimicker, but thankfully it's very, very treatable. Unfortunately, we are in a tropical country. That's one. And two, um, it's not really easy to do contact tracing for TB, especially that many of us might be harboring TB infection, but we are asymptomatic. So without further ado, let me enumerate the objectives of this 2-day session. The first one is to recognize the common presentations of tuberculosis, and we have to be familiar with the epidemiology, manifestations, and differential diagnosis. We have to be able to choose the appropriate workup to establish the diagnosis. Discussing the rationale behind the treatment plan is more of a clinical side, but we will do our best. And definitely, you're already familiar with some of the mechanisms of action, especially of the anti-TB drugs. These have been discussed in your pharmacology, and this is a good opportunity for you to review not only pharmacology but also general pathology. So we won't be discussing the histopathologic features, but by now you should be familiar that it's chronic granulomatous inflammation. We have to recognize the complications and determine when to admit or refer to a specialist. And lastly, we want to institute appropriate prevention and control measures. So most of the material that we will be discussing today and tomorrow were lifted from the National Tuberculosis Control Program Manual of Procedures. So we are now in the 6th edition. And the good thing is it has a counterpart, the so-called Pocket Guide for TB and latent TB screening, diagnosis, and management. I know that you will be rotating in your clinics, and the Manual of Procedures is a 200-page manuscript, although it's a relatively easy read and you don't have to memorize everything that is in the manual. But what is important for your level is to be familiar with the generic guidelines. Of course, when you go to clerkship, you will be seeing patients already. It's not always possible for you to browse through the manual of procedures. So I recommend that you guys download the Pocket Guide. It's a quick guide and it's composed mostly of flowcharts. Many of the flowcharts actually in this lecture were lifted either from the Pocket Guide or from the Manual of Procedures. Okay, so again, that's a suggestion, especially when you go to your outpatient clinics, when you go to the wards. So you will really benefit from using the Pocket Guide. And the Pocket Guide reduced all of the explanatory text, and it really focused on presenting you with the different flowcharts in order to diagnose the patient, in order to interpret the findings, and to come up with an appropriate management plan. And that's the beauty for tuberculosis. It's like like a field that is relatively boxed. If the patient has a complication, if the patient has the following results on direct microscopy, if the patient presents with resistance on gene expert, this is what you have to do. Okay? But definitely there will be times that we will still have to refer to infectious disease specialists. Okay? One important caveat that I already touched on earlier, but I wish to emphasize, is that the guidelines was made for both adult and pediatric patients. And this is important because in the manual of procedures, and you will see, and we will keep on reiterating this earlier, the definition of children is anyone less than 15 years old. Okay, that's an 1-5. That's a very important cutoff, and you will see later on why it is important. So I know that by now you are familiar with the general pathology of tuberculosis. You know that it's caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, although it can be a mimicker, and at the same time, the presentations of TB can be mimicked by a lot of other entities. You know from your microbiology sessions, from your pharmacology sessions, that TB is the being an infectious agent, Mycobacterium tuberculosis is diagnosed on the basis of the presence of the microbiologic organism, either via smear, via culture, or via PCR. And you know that GeneXpert is essentially a community-based polymerase chain reaction kit. Okay? So we'll proceed directly to how TB is screened and diagnosed. So we have touched on this, no? Actually, in research, the difference between screening and diagnosis. For screening, you want a test to have high sensitivity, and for diagnosis, you want a test to have high specificity. In screening, you want to include as many patients as you can in order, especially if your patient or your disease has a quick or an easy management, then definitely you want to initiate management as soon as possible. But if your patient or the management will present with some risk, especially if it can be fatal, and even though most of the medications for tuberculosis are relatively safe, we still want to be sure that we are dealing with the correct diagnosis. We want to be as specific as possible. So unfortunately, there is still a stigma associated with tuberculosis, and many people do not report whenever they have symptoms: unexplained fever, unexplained weight loss, night sweats, and even cough. Okay? So what we want to understand is whether a patient has presumptive TB or is an active case of TB. Presumptive TB is made on the basis, for the most part, of the so-called symptom-based screening. When we do symptom-based screening, this applies to most individuals, and I am using the adjective most because you will see later on that sometimes we don't need a 2-week duration for any of these symptoms. So any individual who presents with a 2-week duration of cough, unexplained fever, unexplained weight loss, and night sweats are all considered cases of presumptive tuberculosis. So when we say unexplained, that means that there is no immediate um, cause for the fever. Let's say that the patient has pneumonia, definitely that will account for the fever. Or the weight loss, let's say that the patient is using certain anti-diabetic medications. And some of these are very popular nowadays for a quick weight loss regimen. So those things. If we cannot explain the reason for the weight loss and the fever, then we have to consider TB, especially if the symptoms have been present for more than 2 weeks already. So when we say systematic screening, this is implemented across all health facilities, and usually we implement this using the 4 symptom screen. Okay? I have emphasized that the symptom screening is based on the presence of the 4 cardinal signs and symptoms. And I cannot stress this enough because you will really grow tired of hearing these 4 symptoms: cough, unexplained fever, unexplained weight loss, and night sweats. And this will be the primary screening tool for screening in all health facilities and in all consults. That is very important. Okay, especially that many of our countrymen, many of our urban poor, usually have their consults in the rural health unit, okay, or in the municipal or city health office. So whether they come for immunization, for maternal checkups, for routine child checkups, we should apply the 4 symptom screening. At the same time, the accompanying persons should also be screened by asking for these 4 signs and symptoms. Now, many of you, especially at your level, you're already third years, right? So you were asked to undergo annual physical examination, and part of the annual physical examination is the chest X-ray. I've mentioned earlier that many of our patients, many of us actually, might be harboring TB infection, but we do not have any symptoms. And therefore, the presence of any lesion in the chest X-ray, especially if these lesions are consistent with tuberculous infections, the so-called gonfocus, the so-called gon complex. You have learned this during your second year. So we might have to undergo treatment, okay, if these lesions are seen on the chest X-ray. When we say active case finding, this is targeted towards patients in congregate settings, in certain communities, and in certain workplaces. So we use chest X-ray as the primary screening tool and Gene Expert as the diagnostic test. We are lucky that we have now Gene Expert because this allows us to get an immediate diagnosis, unlike waiting for TB culture, which can really take several weeks. And for the medical technologists here, or those from the allied health sciences, you know how difficult it is to obtain a positive culture result, not only because of the methodology, but also of the duration by which we wait for the cases. So it's also important to screen for TB co-infection in people living with the human immunodeficiency virus because they are at a higher risk because of their immunocompromised state. As I have mentioned, because now you will be rotating in the hospitals, all health facilities shall screen their workers for TB annually using both the symptom and chest X-ray screen. So whenever what we do is a screening physical examination, right? When you go to the for your annual physical examination. But you will notice that cough, unexplained fever, unexplained weight loss, and night sweats, all of these are part of the screening physical examination. If we have a diagnosed TB case, then all household and close contacts of all ages shall also be screened for TB using the symptom screening and chest X-ray. So we will now begin with the flowcharts. And as I have mentioned, some of you might grow tired of this presentation because we will really follow flowcharts for the screening and diagnosis of TB. The first one is when we do screening for pulmonary TB in adults more than 15 years old. And if the HIV infection status is unknown across health facilities, we ask for the presence of the four symptoms and if they last for more than 2 weeks. As you will notice, the presence of even just one symptom is already sufficient to make the diagnosis of presumptive TB. And therefore, we ask the patient to submit their sputum sample and we request for expert TB with a test for rifampicin resistance. Unfortunately, Gene Expert is not available in certain areas, but many of our cities, many of our municipalities already have health facilities with Gene Expert. But in such instances, we might have to do TB lamp or worse, smear microscopy. So again, these materials have been lifted from the Manual of Procedures of the National Tuberculosis Program. So the important point here will be the guidelines first. The specific procedures, it's not enough that you read them. There's actually a training for the Manual of Procedures of the National TB Program. Okay, so this is just a crash course on the NTP. Let's say that your patient does not present with any of the four signs and symptoms, then we will request for chest X-ray. Again, this is part of the routine screening. And if the chest X-ray findings are suggestive of TB, once again, we consider them as presumptive TB and we request for Gene Expert. Otherwise, if there is no indication in the chest X-ray, then we proceed for the consultation for other diseases. Screening for TB in people living with HIV is somewhat different, and the guidelines matter whether the patient is presenting at the time of diagnosis or the patient is visiting for a routine checkup. Annually and at the time of diagnosis of HIV, we should screen people living with HIV for the four signs and symptoms, and at the same time, we have to do a chest X-ray. Once again, if the answer is yes to any of the four criterion or the chest X-ray is suggestive of TB, we automatically collect one sputum sample for processing via Gene Expert. Again, smear microscopy may be performed when expert testing is not available. However, if all the four signs and symptoms are not present and the chest X-ray is clean, then that will be the end of the screening. We know that many of our PLHIV patients will have to visit the health facilities regularly for checkup and of course, for screening for HIV, for their CD4 count. But for each subsequent visit, we do not have to request for chest X-ray anymore. We just do the four symptom screening. So I hope that is clear. For any patient where in the TB status, where in the HIV status is unknown, we begin first with the four symptom screening, followed by the chest X-ray, if none of the criteria are present. However, for people living with HIV, on their first consult and at the time of diagnosis of HIV, we do the four symptom screening along with the chest X-ray. So we do the both together. Whereas for every subsequent visit, we only have to do screening for the four signs and symptoms. So I hope that is clear. So because we are in the pediatrics module, we also have to focus on children. As I have mentioned earlier, children are defined in the manual of operations as anyone less than 15 years old. So what do we do for these children? What you will notice is that there is a visible absence of chest X-ray as part of the flow chart. Okay? Or what I mean is that okay, I'll elucidate that further. So first, there should be one of the following signs and symptoms for 2 weeks. But what you will notice is that these are not necessarily the same as the four symptom screening. Unexplained cough or wheezing, unexplained fever after ruling out other causes, unexplained weight loss, but aside from weight loss, we also address failure to thrive and the absence of response to nutrition therapy based on the FNRI weight for age, then these are symptoms that we should watch out for in patients less than 15 years old. Okay? There is also one other caveat. If we have pediatric patients who do not present with any of these signs and symptoms, but for more than 2 weeks, they are presenting with fatigue, with decreased activity, decreased playfulness, and poor appetite, then we also consider them as presumptive TB. Okay? So you will notice that for patients more than 15 years old, it's easy to memorize fever, weight cough, unexplained fever, unexplained weight loss, and night sweats. But for children, we have to consider the unexplained fever, loss of appetite, failure to thrive, decreased activity, fatigue, okay, wheezing as well, because of course many of our children are also prone to asthmatic attacks. If these symptoms are present, then we consider a case of presumptive. Now, if a patient has a chest X-ray taken for other reasons, like for instance, we are ruling out pneumonia, and there are lesions suggestive of a tuberculosis infection, then definitely um, we will consider that patient a candidate for the collection of sputum. Okay, so this is what I'm saying about chest X-ray. If any of the signs and symptoms that I mentioned earlier are present and we are able to collect sputum samples, therefore we have samples available for expert TB and rifampicin resistances, then we proceed directly to this arm of the flow chart. But if we are not able to take samples, then that is the time when we do chest X-ray. Okay? So later on, we will proceed with the diagnostic algorithm. You will notice that many of the algorithms that I'm presenting to you right now are really based on screening for symptoms, okay? Or for the diagnosis of presumptive TB. Now, it's also possible, for instance, in prisons, okay, or in certain high-risk workplaces, in the home for the aged or the elderly, we can do targeted screening. And when we do targeted screening, this is done annually. And instead of using the four symptom screen, because remember that we are dealing with quite a number of individuals in these settings, we proceed directly to chest X-ray. If the chest X-ray is suggestive of TB, we collect sputum and we have the patient undergo the gene expert. Otherwise, if the chest X-ray is not suggestive of TB, that will be the end of our screening. So far, what have we discussed? We have discussed patients more than 15 years old whose HIV status is unknown. We have discussed people living with HIV. We have discussed patients who are younger than 50 years old. So this is what we define as children for this manual of procedures. And lastly, we discussed targeted community, workplace, and congregate settings. And we are all dealing with screening still at this point. So we cannot specify this enough. You are already considered healthcare workers because you already have work in the hospital. So when after you graduate and when you begin to apply for any work, whether hospitals, clinics, private, whether private or government institutions, you will notice that before you are officially employed, you will have to undergo TB symptom screening and chest X-ray. The follow-up screening is composed of TB symptom screening only, but the annual APE of healthcare workers, as I have mentioned earlier, will require symptom screening and chest X-ray. So by now, you are familiar with these four symptoms. And as mentioned, if any of the symptoms or the chest X-ray are present, then we collect the sputum specimen for gene expert. Okay, so I have mentioned earlier that it's also important for the contacts of TB, of diagnosed cases of active TB, to be screened as well for tuberculosis. But there is a difference. Later on and by tomorrow, we will be discussing drug-resistant tuberculosis. But there are differences in the screening of these contacts, especially if their index patient is a drug-resistant TB case. So for the chest X-ray screening, if your TB contact, if the TB contact is from a drug-susceptible case, then we only do chest X-ray for all 5 years old and above. However, if the case is a drug-resistant tuberculosis case, then regardless of the age, we do chest X-ray screening. If chest X-ray is unfortunately not available, then all contacts should undergo gene expert. Okay? In contrast, in drug-susceptible TB contacts, if the chest X-ray is not available, we do symptom screening. For both drug-sensitive and drug-resistant TB contacts, expert is the preferred diagnostic test. If active TB is ruled out, and this is what we will be discussing tomorrow, then we can do tuberculosis preventive treatment or TPT for drug-sensitive or drug-susceptible contacts. But TPT is not recommended if the case is already drug-resistant. Okay? The follow-up is every 6 months for 2 years. However, you will notice that um, for drug-resistant TB contacts, if chest X-ray is not available, then we do expert test directly. Okay? So these are the differences whether the contacts are from a drug-susceptible or drug-resistant case. So there are differences, but the key point here is that for chest X-ray screening for drug-resistant TB contacts, all are candidates for chest X-ray screening. For diagnostic testing, it's the same. The preferred is GeneXpert. TPT is initiated in drug-susceptible TB contacts but not in drug-resistant TB contacts. And for follow-up, we can do GeneXpert if chest X-ray is not available. I hope that so far you are still okay with all the diagrams that I'm presenting. Now, when you rotate in the wards in the hospitals, you will see annotations for the results of your GeneXpert. As I have mentioned, GeneXpert is simply a polymerase chain reaction-based diagnostic test, and because this is based on nucleic acid amplification, we can readily obtain the results within the same day. So the different notations that you might see in the charts and the results are as follows: T, RR, TI, and I. Okay? So if T is the notation, then Mycobacterium tuberculosis is detected, but there is no rifampicin resistance. If the notation is RR, TB is detected, and at the same time, there is resistance to rifampicin. If you see TI, TB is detected, but rifampicin resistance is indeterminate. And that is fine because as you will see in the subsequent flowcharts, we still have steps to undertake for if the rifampicin resistance is indeterminate. If the annotation is N, then MTB is not detected. And when the notation is I, the result is either invalid, there is no result, or there is an error. Usually, what is the cause for such results? Maybe the sample is not sufficient, or the sample is severely compromised. Like let's say it was not transported and packed properly. Okay? Or sometimes it's the actual equipment that is malfunctioning, and therefore we're not able to obtain the results for that case. So we are done with screening for tuberculosis. We will now go to the diagnosis. Again, I hope that the difference between the screening and diagnosis are different. For screening, we want to enroll as many patients as possible because we want to determine if they have active TB. Diagnosis, we don't want to initiate TB treatment for patients who do not have active TB, okay, or false positive on screening. So because this is your pediatric module, so we will first discuss the approach to diagnosis of tuberculosis in children. I'm sure you are tired by now, but again, for the purposes of this MOP, children are defined as less than 50 years old. So again, we begin with the diagnosis of a presumptive TB, those with wheezing, fever, okay, or a chest X-ray done for other purposes, but there are lesions characteristic of TB. So we have to classify first whether the patient has risk factors for TB. And what are those risk factors? The patient is either less than 5 years old, the patient unfortunately has contracted HIV, severely malnourished, the patient has measles, or on immunosuppressant drugs. Okay? So if this is a presumptive pulmonary TB, we collect sample from patient, especially for patients who are able to expectorate. So these patients are usually at least 8 years old, but if that is not feasible, then we can collect gastric aspirates. Okay. On the other hand, if the patient is a presumptive extrapulmonary TB, so that's the meaning of EPTB, we collect the tissue that the pus, the tissue or the fluid for expert studies. Okay. Then we still collect these extrapulmonary samples for culture and further testing. Okay. Now the problem is what if we have patients who we have difficulty collecting samples? For instance, what if the sample is from the bone? So definitely we will have to refer to a hematologist because hematologists are capable of obtaining bone marrow cores. Okay. Then we have discussed earlier the different notations for gene expert. So let's say we have collected the tissue or the sputum sample for doing for gene expert. So if we detected MTV, then we can initiate treatment. So we will be discussing treatment in the subsequent slides or in the subsequent session. But as I have mentioned, this is best explained by our IDS specialists. But thankfully, the MOP is a very friendly manual that even at your level, you can understand the general provisions. Okay? If unfortunately we are not able to detect MTB or the patient is not able to expectorate and we cannot perform gastric aspiration, then we can perform chest X-ray. If the chest X-ray is strongly suggestive of tuberculosis with clinical signs and symptoms, then we can proceed to treatment. So what are the signs and symptoms of chest X-ray that are suggestive of TB? This includes enlarged hilar lymph nodes. This includes miliary mottling, massive pleural effusion, and opacification in the apical lobe of the liver, especially if there is cavitation. You will be discussing this when you go to your radiology module. So I believe that the radio module allows you to take a look at representative images characteristic of certain or of the most common diseases. If we are still uncertain about the presence of TB on chest X-ray, but the symptoms are persisting, then we can give a broad spectrum antibiotic. Take note that these broad spectrum antibiotics are still not the treatment for TB. Okay? But if the signs and symptoms persist, then we have to evaluate whether that patient is a contact of an active TB case or not a contact. So if the patient is a contact of an active TB case, we treat them as clinically diagnosed tuberculosis. So that is the meaning of CD2B. Otherwise, we do a tuberculin skin testing, which we will further explain in the subsequent sessions. Then, if the TST is positive, then we treat the case as a clinically diagnosed TB. Otherwise, we now refer the patient a subspecialist. Okay, so I will give you a hint for the exam. Because you are now at the level wherein you have gone beyond the, what do you call this, the pathophysiology of the various diseases that we are discussing, the important The important thing here is to take note of the changes in the diagnostic algorithm or the diagnostic algorithm that we have to apply for the different populations that we are discussing. Okay, so in the exam, you might be asked what decision to make. Let's say if your MTB was detected and there is no rifampicin resistance. So it is this part of the flow chart. So most of the exams will on the flow charts that we have presented. Please excuse me for a bit, okay? I just have to reply to an urgent message. 1 minute. Okay, so let's continue with the different flow charts. So I have mentioned this already, that there are certain chest X-ray findings that are strongly suggestive of pulmonary TB in children and adolescents. And again, for the purposes of the MOE, we actually define children as less than 50 years old. However, it's important to note that the different chest X-ray findings um, vary depending upon the age of the patient. And you will see that for patients less than 10 years old, or these are the usual findings: right hilar lymphadenopathy, the presence of chronic pneumonia, or the presence of a miliary pattern. Whereas for patients more than 10 years old to 18 years old, then cavitations and pleural effusion are the other findings that we see in the chest X-ray. Additionally, you will have noticed that again, the signs and symptoms might slightly vary among pediatric patients. For instance, aside from the fever, weight loss, and cough, irritability is a constant or a relatively common finding among pediatric patients less than 10 years old. For patients who are 10 to 18 years old, then we have the presence of persistent fever, adynamia, or expectoration of bloody sputum. Okay? So this will be discussed further in your radiology module, but at least you now have an idea of the common chest X-ray findings. Okay? Sige. This is something that I have presented earlier, the different notations for Gene Expert. But as I have mentioned, it's now important for you to know what to do when you are given a specific findings. So for instance, if Mycobacterium tuberculosis is detected, but there is no resistance to rifampicin, we can proceed directly with the treatment for drug-susceptible TB, okay, the regimen. If MTB is detected, but but there is also resistance to rifampicin, we have to classify the patient whether there is a high risk for drug-resistant TB or a low risk for drug-resistant TB. If the risk is low, we have to repeat the test. But if the risk is high, then we have to do other testing. So we collect baseline sputum samples or other technologies such as LAMP or the line probe assay, and as well as testing for the second line drugs. We also check the eligibility criteria for standard treatment regimens before we apply the necessary treatment. Don't worry about this because we will be discussing them when we come to the section on treatment. That is the other heavy portion of this lecture. So there are four parts: the diagnosis, treatment, and the reporting. But the reporting part will be much shorter. If the resistance is indeterminate, it simply tells us that we have to collect a new specimen and to do the repeat testing. Whatever the result of the second test is, that is what we follow and we treat accordingly. If the result is still indeterminate, we treat it as drug susceptible TB. Okay. If the result is also invalid, then we also collect additional samples. Okay. If MTB is not detected, then we reassess the patient and we take the chest X-ray. We investigate for extrapulmonary TB and we may do an antibiotic trial if the findings are not consistent with tuberculosis. Okay. So this is sort of summarizing what we have discussed so far for the classification and diagnosis of TB. So there is bacteriologic testing for TB, but that's essentially gene expert. Okay. If any of the following tests, such as gene experts, smear microscopy, TB culture, or TB lab, then we classify the patient as bacteriologically confirmed. You will notice that earlier I have been mentioning the term clinically diagnosed TB. And clinically diagnosed TB simply refers to patients who are not positive in any of our tests, but the clinical signs and symptoms are consistent with TB. We have chest X-ray findings, and then we do other tests that might be supportive of TB, such as IGRA, such as TSP, such as biopsy samples. Then we can classify the patient as a clinically diagnosed TB. For your level, you might be wondering how we come up with such a diagnosis, but this is really the physician's discretion whether to treat the case as TB or not. The anatomical sites for TB are only two, whether they are pulmonary or extrapulmonary. But in the succeeding session, you will learn that for extrapulmonary TB, we give important attention to certain sites, such as the bone or the, the bone and the central nervous system. As an overview for the treatment of TB, we have to classify patients whether they are new or retreatment. And lastly, we have to know the drug resistance patterns. Don't worry, if this feels overwhelming for you, we will be able to elucidate this further when we go to the treatment section. But once again, when we classify patients who have TB, we classify them whether they have bacteriologically confirmed or clinically diagnosed TB. We classify them based on the location of the anatomicals of the tuberculosis, whether it's pulmonary or extrapulmonary. We also have to know whether the patient is undergoing treatment or this is a new case of TB. And lastly, based on the results of your gene expert, you have to know whether there is resistance to rifampicin and other drugs. Okay, I will have to stop at this point because I do not want to cut our discussion on treatment because this is actually the largest portion of this report. But what I wanted to do, so you still have an additional 1 hour, and I'm attending a second conference at this point. What I want you to do is to download the NTP or MOP, or I'll actually just send it to your class representative. I'll send it via email so that you can begin reading. And tomorrow, the bulk of our discussion will be on the treatment of tuberculosis. If you have questions for this session, I will ask you to reserve it for tomorrow and we can discuss them further. But again, just to summarize what we have discussed today, for patients who are suspected of tuberculosis, the important thing for them is to be screened and to eventually make the diagnosis. In order to make the diagnosis, we have to have bacteriological confirmation. And right now, for most settings, the ideal or the recommended confirmatory test will be Gene Expert. We have to understand the meaning of the different findings on Gene Expert in order to determine the type of treatment that we will institute for the patient. Okay. So if you have questions, again, I will ask you to reserve them for tomorrow. And I will see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. And I think there are still ongoing repairs and inspections here in the campus. So I will just await for the final advisory from the administration. And if ever that we have they're still undergoing some inspection or repairs, we might have to do it online tomorrow again. Okay. So if you have questions, reserve them tomorrow, and I will see you at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Okay. So we might have to use the 2 hours, but not really the entire 2 hours. Okay. Siguro at most mga 1.5 hours. Okay. So thank you very much for listening, and I will share with your classmate the PowerPoint shortly.
Thank you, Doc.
Thank you, Doc.
Thank you, Doc.
Thank you, Doc.